I am a park ranger, and I'm pretty sure Bigfoot killed my dog. At the time, I was gathering illegally placed wildlife cameras while knocking down hunting stands and feeders, just me and my dog Macy. It was getting dark, so we started to head back, but my ATV wouldn't start. The battery had been disconnected. I reconnected it and started to drive, but less than half a mile later the whole thing died. I radioed back to send someone to pick us up. They said it would be an hour, so my dog and I settled down and started a small fire. Soon I heard the screams again. It sounded unlike anything I had ever heard. I called out asking if anyone needed help. No answer. The screams were less than 1,000 feet away. I radioed in to see how much longer we had to wait. They hadn't left yet, so I decided to find the source of the screams. I walked in that direction, but the screams stopped whenever I got close. After 20 minutes I gave up and walked back. The screams continued once I had left. Thinking this was some kind of twisted joke, I became angry. I sprinted after the sound, getting closer and closer. Suddenly my dog took off, and seconds later I heard terrified yelps and then nothing. I searched for hours but found nothing. The next day I came back with the rest of the rangers. We found what was left of her. Just a few patches of fur and a set of massive human-like footprints in the snow. I'm a hunter. What I saw through my night vision scope still haunts me to this day. I'm a hunter. I like to hunt wild boar specifically. Though I have been deer hunting and have been known to get a turkey for Thanksgiving, I mostly hunt boar. For those of you that don't know, boar are a big problem in the United States. Given that pigs eat anything and everything, it's not hard to see why the Department of Fish and Wildlife makes it legal to hunt them with almost no restrictions. In my state, it's illegal to hunt most large mammals with night or thermal vision scopes, with the exception of boar and coyote. There was an area that was peppered with boar activity that I knew would be perfect for a night hunt. It was easily accessible with my truck, with easy-to-find spots that I could set up and that overlooked a large, easy-to-navigate clearing. The night started uneventful, mostly me tinkering with my new toy, cycling through the settings. I was a little impatient. I'd spotted multiple deer, but they were out of season, and like I mentioned earlier, my current setup wasn't legal for deer. I moved to another spot I'd seen days earlier that probably wasn't much better than my first, but it gave me something to do and a new angle to look around with my new scope. After an hour or so of glassing the area, it dawned on me. This spot doesn't have much animal activity at all, no rabbit or owls. The deer that I'd seen were hundreds of yards from where I was. Why was this pocket of land so dead at night but lively in the day? I'd set up around 10 p.m. and it was about 2 a.m. when I started to think about packing up, maybe setting up a target before I left and taking some practice shots. I heard a crunch come from the direction I came from before. I panned my scope over and saw the silhouette of a small bear pushing through the bushes. It's important to note that my scope isn't exactly night vision. It's a thermal scope, kind of like a black and white version of what you see in the Predator movies. I adjusted my range and zoomed in a little. I remember jolting a little when I saw that it wasn't really a bear, it was a man. Because he was so low and hunched over, I thought I was looking at a young bear. Is that a game warden? It couldn't be. I would have seen the headlights coming up the road from where I was perched. And where could he have walked from? I was 30 miles away from anything and on public lands. I was about to call out when I adjusted my sights and noticed he was naked. No shoes, pants, or anything. I remember being disturbed by his movements, like a squirrel or something. Twitchy and grabbing at the foliage, sniffing around and palming the tree. Was that my tree? The one I'd been leaning against earlier. The thought terrified me. Could he smell me? Then he did something I still have nightmares about today. He squatted and placed his hands in the dirt between his feet and stared straight up like a dog mid-howl. And I heard it, a voice coming from that direction, a very compelling female voice. "Help! I'm lost." There was a long pause, but neither of us moved a muscle. The center of my sights was trained at the dirt in front of his feet. I couldn't bring myself to aim directly at another person. It went against everything I'd been taught about firearms. Were they lost? Was this some guy that had gone crazy out here? Why was his voice so feminine? "Help! Please! I can't walk!" The voice called out. That's when I called bullshit. Not only could he walk, when I first saw him, he was traversing the land with ease for a naked person, so good I mistook him for a bear. That's a fucking trap. This guy is trying to lure me to him with a damsel in distress routine. Luckily, the lack of activity before had caused me to pack up most of my gear. I think I may have left behind a hat and a sitting pad, but I didn't give a shit in that moment. I took my eyes off him for a moment to get my pack on. I buckled my chest strap and scrambled for my rifle. To my horror, he was in the same position, but his face was staring in my direction, and I swear I saw a smile. The thermal scope has an effect that makes animals' eyes appear white. I took my eyes off him for a moment to get my pack on. I buckled my chest strap and scrambled for my rifle. To my horror, he was in the same position, but his face was staring in my direction, and I swear I saw him smile. How the hell had he heard me get up and put my gear on? He must have easily been 150 yards away. "Fuck off!" I screamed in that direction. He stood upright, and it hit me how tall and skinny he was. Easily 6 feet and very lean. He took a couple of long strides in my direction, and I instinctively sent a round sailing above his head into the tree line. He was freaky as hell, but he hadn't really threatened me. What would I tell the cops? I was unwilling and unready to shoot someone. He stopped dead in his tracks and hunched down on all fours. "The next one will fuck you up. Go away." He stayed on all fours, and this time I had my sights trained on the center of him. His eyes were just above the grass like a large cat or something. I was trying to stop my trembling and knew that my voice had cracked a little on that last warning. I was terrified. That standoff probably only lasted a minute or two, maybe less, but it felt like forever. In an instant he bolted left towards the tree line opposite the road. So much for not being able to walk. I could barely keep him in my scope, he was moving so fast. He disappeared into the brush, and I sent another bullet sailing high in his direction. I racked another round and tried to pocket that mag and swap for a fresh one, but I dropped it and didn't bother looking for it. I wasn't far from my truck, and I wanted to get out of there. I could hear him in the distance, yelling in this weird sound that could have been a laugh or a cry. I scrambled up the trail and arrived at my truck breathless. I tossed my gear into the cab but kept the rifle in the passenger seat and sped off. I never saw him again. Follow for more horror stories. I grew up on a farm in Alberta, Canada. The creature I saw still haunts me to this day. When I was 13, I was on an ATV with my 2 older sisters, one 15 and the other 18. We were going to my grandma's, which was less than 2 kilometers away from my parents' place. We were traveling through our fields, but on the way I suggested we go round the fence so we didn't have to open the gates. It was pretty much the same path, just a bit off to the side. We had gates because this was our pasture for the cows. As we get to the middle of the field, we all noticed something sitting on top the hill we were about to climb. On top this hill we had a somewhat big pile of rocks from working the fields a long time ago. We slowed to a crawl because it looked human. We thought maybe a calf fell and was stuck, or maybe it was my uncle who looked after the cattle. But this thing was sitting weird, basically like how Spider-Man perches over buildings, crouched down on top a rock. As we were sitting there trying to figure out what we were seeing, this thing slowly stood up and my heart sank. Its arms were long, grossly long. I screamed stop and instantly jumped from the front of the ATV to the driver, replacing my sister. As we were switching, this thing started running at us, but it was running weird. Its arms were swaying back and forth like a normal runner. But because of how long the arms were, it looked weird. You would think it would run on the long arms, but it didn't. It was running fast. I turned around and shot off straight through the field. My sisters were screaming it was still coming, but I honestly could not look back at this thing. I just said, "Don't look at it." We rounded the corner and that's the last we seen it. After that corner it's trails to my parents' house. As we got home I crashed the ATV into the deck trying to get in as fast as we could. We were so scared my parents actually believed us. They called all the family to warn if it was a trespasser. They said nobody seen anything or anyone in the fields. Now I want to describe this thing. It was tall, skinny, and wore no clothes. Just a body is what we could see. Grayish color, and the head wasn't shaped like a human's. It was thin and small. We were about 30 to 40 meters from this thing, and it chased us in broad daylight. Follow for more horror stories. I'm a volunteer for a local search and rescue team. I still can't explain what I saw on my first rescue. Years ago, I moved from a very small town to a remote valley out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by national forest and not many neighbors. It was just what I had always wanted. At that point in my life, I had been a paramedic for about 5 years and, being an outdoorsy, civic-minded sort, I decided to volunteer my services with a local search and rescue organization. For being such a tiny, poorly funded organization, we were surprisingly busy. In the 9 years I was with them, we'd have at least one rescue, sometimes several every weekend, spring through fall. The source of the majority of these calls was the roughly 100 miles of poorly maintained fire trails that were very popular with dirt bike and quad riders. When they'd inevitably get lost or wreck and get injured, we'd head out, track them down, provide medical care, and fly them out on a helicopter. About 2 weeks after joining, and with zero training beyond what I had learned as a Boy Scout and medic, I got my first call. A group of dirt bikers from the city had lost a member of their party. For some reason, they had put their least experienced rider at the back of the group of a dozen or so riders and took off into the woods. When they returned to the trailhead for hours later, the inexperienced guy was missing. They set out again and looked for him for 4 or 5 hours, then gave up and called 911. The time interval from the initial 911 call until we had a squad assembled at the trailhead was pretty impressive. No more than 20 minutes, but we were already 8 or 9 hours behind the ball. We did a very quick briefing, distributed maps, divided into teams, then set off. They put me on a quad with the most experienced guy, and we headed out. The plan was for each 2 to 3-person team to take one of the longer trails that ringed the place. After searching those, we'd systematically work our way into the shorter, maze-like trails that made up the interior. This was to be a hasty search, none of that grid search crap. Just riding around looking for clues. I don't know what I had expected, exactly. Maybe a few dirt roads through the woods or something, but these trails were an absolute nightmare. They were extremely rugged, technical trails, where you really had to know what you were doing and where you were going or you'd never make it out. GPS rarely worked due to the rugged terrain and tree cover. Radios and cell phones were a crapshoot, and the maps didn't account for all the random trails riders would just sort of make. The only marked roads were fire breaks, and mileage-wise those accounted for maybe 10% of the trails. Why this guy hadn't been partnered with someone or put at the front of the group is a mystery. For hours into this I'm caked with mud, bleeding from being hit with branches, exhausted, and just completely done. We take a water break and hear broken radio traffic that sounds like the bike has been found. But no rider. It's only a couple of miles from us, so we head that direction. When we get there, the bike is off to the side of the road, along with the quads of the other teams, but we can see them a few 100 feet in the woods. We walk over and find them looking down at the missing person, who is very dead, lips blue. Skin dusky, arms spread out like a cross. On first glance, his eyes looked to be wide open and solid white, but when I examined him I could see that his eyes were actually covered with fly eggs. Dude had been dead a while. It didn't make sense though. His bike still had gas in it, he had water and food, and he was a healthy guy in his late 20s. Why was he dead? It looked like he had simply laid his bike down, then ran into the woods to die. We wrapped him in blankets, then put him on the Stokes and took him to the trailhead where the coroner was waiting. About a week later I ran into the coroner and asked what the cause of death had been. The pathologist's determination was cardiac dystonia secondary to extreme anxiety. The guy literally died of fright, which up to that point I had always assumed was Hollywood BS. I've always wondered what was going through his head. Was he just afraid of the woods, or of being lost? If so, why did he run blindly into the woods instead of continuing to follow the trail? There's a part of me that thinks he may have seen something out there. I've heard a lot of stories about weird shit in these woods, and I've seen a few strange things myself, so it wouldn't surprise me. Follow for more horror stories.